This story is based on real letters, diaries, and first-person accounts from black American soldiers stationed in England during World War II. He had learned the rules before he could read. They were not written in any book his mother kept in the house, nor spoken aloud, except in warnings muttered low when white folks passed too close on the sidewalk. The rules lived in the tightening of his father's jaw when they walked past the drugstore with the soda fountain, in the way his grandmother's voice dropped to a murmur when she said certain words, in the practiced blankness that settled over his older brother's face whenever a police officer slowed his car at the corner. By the time he was 7, he knew which water fountains he could drink from, which doors he could enter, which sections of the bus were his to occupy. He knew these things the way he knew his own name, and with approximately the same degree of choice in the matter. The town where he grew up sat in the middle of Georgia, a place of red clay roads and whitewashed churches and summer heat that pressed down like something physical. His family had lived there for 3 generations, farming land they did not own, saving what little they could, sending their children to the colored school when work permitted. His father drove a delivery truck for a white-owned grocery. His mother took in laundry and ironing, her hands perpetually raw from lye soap and hot water. They were, by the standards of their community, doing well enough. They had a house with a sound roof. They had food most days. They had stayed out of trouble. Staying out of trouble was its own form of labor. It required constant attention, the endless calibration of tone and posture and eye contact. It meant knowing when to step off the sidewalk, when to remove your hat, when to say yes, sir, and no, ma'am, regardless of the age or circumstance of the white person addressing you. It meant swallowing words that rose in your throat, swallowing anger and humiliation, and the simple human desire to be treated as though you mattered. His father had told him once, in a rare moment of explicit instruction, that a colored man who forgot himself could end up dead, and that the law would not trouble itself over the matter. This was not said with drama or emphasis. It was stated as fact, the way one might mention that winter follows autumn, or that rain makes the roads muddy. The soldier, he was not yet a soldier then, just a boy of 16 with long limbs and his mother's serious eyes, had wanted to believe there might be something different elsewhere. He had heard stories, fragments of possibility carried by relatives who had gone north to Chicago or Detroit. Letters that spoke of factory work and neighborhoods where colored people lived without the constant weight of surveillance. But the stories always contained their own warnings. The cold, the police, the different species of hatred that wore a northern face. And besides, leaving required money his family did not have, connections they had not made, a kind of boldness that felt dangerous even to imagine. The war came as a disruption to a life that had seemed, if not good, then at least predictable in its constraints. He was 19 when the draft notice arrived, old enough to understand what it meant, and young enough to feel something other than dread. His mother had wept, not from patriotic fervor, but from fear, the kind of fear that any mother feels when the government claims her son. His father had said nothing at all, only gripped his shoulder once, hard, and walked out to the yard to smoke a cigarette in the November twilight. Basic training took place in the South, on an army base where segregation was as rigidly enforced as in any civilian town. The colored soldiers slept in separate barracks, ate in separate mess halls, trained in separate units. The white officers who commanded them maintained a careful distance, their authority expressed through intermediaries and formal protocol. There were moments of confusion. The army needed soldiers, needed bodies to fill uniforms and carry rifles, and yet seemed uncertain about what to do with the colored men it had conscripted. They were taught to shoot and march and salute, but always with the understanding that they would not fight alongside white troops, that their service would be limited to labor battalions and support roles, that their uniforms did not grant them the respect accorded to white soldiers wearing the same cloth. He had expected this. He had spent his entire life preparing for this, for the particular kind of exclusion that pretended to be inclusion. What he had not expected was the journey across the Atlantic, the grey churn of water that seemed to go on without end, the crowded transport ship where coloured and white soldiers occupied different sections but breathed the same salt air and vomited over the same railings. What he had not expected was England. They arrived in the spring of 1944, when the hedgerows were thick with green and the light stayed in the sky until late evening. The base where his unit was stationed sat in the countryside, a collection of Nissen huts and muddy roads and the constant rumble of aircraft overhead. The work was what he had anticipated: loading supplies, driving trucks, building and repairing infrastructure for the white combat units that would eventually cross the Channel. The labor was hard and the days were long, and the rain fell with a persistence that seemed to seep into everything, but none of this troubled him. He had not come expecting comfort. What troubled him in those first weeks was the civilians. The English people who lived in the nearby villages and towns did not behave as he had learned to expect. They nodded at him on the street. They said good morning when he passed. They did not step aside or demand deference or treat his presence as an affront to the natural order of things. An old woman at a bus stop had offered him a piece of hard candy from her handbag, a gesture so casual and unremarkable that he had stood there paralyzed, uncertain how to respond. A shopkeeper had called him love, in that way the English seemed to use with everyone, and sold him a newspaper without any visible hesitation or disdain. He did not trust it at first. He assumed there must be some hidden structure he had not yet learned, some set of rules that would reveal themselves once he made the inevitable mistake. He kept his head down, spoke when spoken to, maintained the careful neutral expression he had perfected over 19 years of Southern life, but the rules did not appear. The punishment did not come. The English people continued to treat him as though he were simply another human being, unremarkable in his presence, entitled to basic courtesy. His sergeant, a man from Alabama with a voice like gravel and opinions that required no guessing, had warned the unit about fraternizing with the locals. The warning had been particularly pointed when it came to English women, delivered with the kind of crude threats that needed no elaboration. But the sergeant's authority extended only so far, and when the soldiers had leave and went into town, they found that the English civilians had not received the same instructions. Young women spoke to them at dances. Families invited them to Sunday dinner. Pub landlords served them without segregating the rooms. It produced a strange cognitive dissonance, this collision of American expectation and British reality. The colored soldiers found themselves moving through two different worlds, the rigidly segregated American military structure and the considerably less rigid British civilian sphere. On base, they used separate facilities and took orders from white officers and occupied the social position they had always occupied. Off base, they discovered that the English did not seem to care very much about American racial hierarchies, or at least did not feel obliged to enforce them. There were complications, of course. The white American soldiers resented the freedom their colored counterparts found in English towns. There were fights, sometimes, outside pubs or at dances, American whites objecting to the sight of colored soldiers dancing with English women or sitting at tables in cafes. The military police tried to impose order, but the English civilians had their own ideas about whose behavior was objectionable, and often it was not the colored soldiers they asked to leave. He tried not to think too much about what any of it meant. Thinking led to hoping, and hoping was a dangerous indulgence for a man who would eventually return to Georgia. Better to accept the strangeness, to treat England as a temporary aberration, to store these experiences away without examining them too closely. But the mind has its own imperatives, and whether he wanted to or not, he found himself comparing the weight of the air here to the weight of the air at home, measuring the space he was allowed to occupy, noticing the absence of the constant low-grade vigilance that had governed his entire life, The café sat on a corner in a market town about 3 miles from the base. He had walked past it several times, always with other soldiers, always moving with purpose toward some other destination. It was not a fancy establishment, just a small room with a few tables, lace curtains in the windows, a handwritten menu board listing tea and sandwiches and cakes when ingredients allowed. The kind of place that would have been unambiguously off-limits at home, not by written law after a certain point, but by the weight of custom and consequence. He had told himself he would not go in alone. There was safety in numbers, in the presence of other colored soldiers who could witness and verify whatever happened. But on a Tuesday afternoon in June, walking back from an errand in town, he found himself standing in front of the café with no particular place he needed to be, and a strange, reckless feeling in his chest that he did not entirely recognize. The door was propped open to let in the warm air. Through the opening he could see 3 or 4 tables occupied by English civilians, older women mostly, and one man reading a newspaper. No one was looking toward the street. No one would necessarily notice if he simply walked away. He thought about his mother's hands, red and cracked from washing other people's clothes. He thought about his father's face when the white grocer spoke to him like he was a child, that careful blankness that hid everything worth hiding. He thought about the colored waiting room at the train station back home, the separate entrance, the understood geography of permitted space. He thought about the fact that he was wearing a uniform, that he was thousands of miles from Georgia, that the English people he had encountered so far had given him no specific reason to expect humiliation. He stepped through the door. The interior smelled of tea and something baking, a yeasty warmth that reminded him briefly of his grandmother's kitchen. The floor was uneven, the tables mismatched, everything worn but clean. A woman in her 50s emerged from a back room, wiping her hands on an apron, and looked at him with the expression of someone seeing a customer rather than an intruder. "Afternoon," she said. "What can I get you?" Her accent was thick enough that he had to concentrate to pass the words, but her tone was neutral, even friendly. He stood just inside the doorway, every muscle in his body prepared for the moment when her expression would change, when she would remember herself and tell him to leave, or that colored soldiers had their own places, or any of the 1,000 variations on exclusion he had learned to anticipate. "Tea, please," he heard himself say. His voice came out steady, which surprised him. "Course, have a seat, love. I'll bring it over." She gestured toward the empty tables with a casual wave and disappeared into the back room. He stood motionless for several seconds, waiting for the correction, the clarification, the inevitable revelation that he had misunderstood. But no correction came. The other customers glanced at him briefly, then returned to their tea and conversation. The man with the newspaper turned a page without looking up. He walked slowly to a table by the window and sat down. The chair was wooden, slightly wobbly, ordinary in every respect. Through the window, he could see the street, people walking past, a bicycle leaning against a lamp-post. Everything looked exactly as it had looked from outside, but from this vantage point, it felt different, felt like he was occupying a space that should not have been available to him. The woman returned with a pot of tea and a cup on a tray, set them on the table without ceremony. "Sugar's on the table," she said, nodding toward a small bowl. "Anything else?" "No, thank you, Mum." She smiled, a brief, ordinary smile that held no particular significance, and returned to the back room. He sat very still, looking at the teapot. The cup was white china with a small chip on the rim. The tea inside was dark and steaming. There was nothing remarkable about any of it, except the fact that it was in front of him, that he had walked through a door and sat down and ordered like any other customer and had been served without incident. He poured the tea slowly, added sugar, stirred. The spoon clinked softly against the china. He lifted the cup and drank, and the tea was hot and strong and slightly bitter, And he was sitting in a cafe in England on a Tuesday afternoon in June, and no one was telling him to leave. The feeling that rose in him then was not joy exactly. Joy would have been too simple, too clean. This was something more complicated, a kind of grief mixed with relief, a sudden sharp awareness of everything he had been denied and everything he had learned not to want. He thought about all the cafes he had walked past at home, all the lunch counters and diners and ice cream parlors where his money would not have been accepted, where his presence would have been treated as an act of aggression. He thought about the careful choreography required just to buy a sandwich, the separate windows, the understood protocols, the exhausting labor of remaining invisible while still managing to be served. Here, in this small cafe with its mismatched tables and chipped cups, he was visible. He existed as a customer, a soldier, a person whose desire for tea was considered legitimate and unremarkable. And the strange, terrible thing was how ordinary it felt once the initial shock subsided. How quickly the simple act of sitting and drinking tea began to seem like something he had always been allowed to do. An older couple came in while he was finishing his tea, nodded pleasantly in his direction, took a table across the room. The woman who ran the cafe emerged to take their order, asked after their daughter who was working in London, discussed the weather. Life continued around him with absolute normality, as though his presence required no special accommodation or consideration. He stayed for perhaps 30 minutes, nursing the tea longer than necessary, reluctant to leave this pocket of ordinary dignity. When he finally stood to go, he placed coins on the table, the correct amount, he had learned the currency, and walked to the door. The cafe owner called after him, "Ta, love, come again." And he nodded, not quite trusting his voice, and stepped back out into the street. The walk back to base took him through town, and then along a narrow road bordered by hedgerows. He moved slowly, trying to understand what had shifted inside him. Nothing had changed, really. He was still a colored soldier in a segregated army. He would still return to Georgia when the war ended, would still step off sidewalks and use separate facilities and swallow anger at insults he could not afford to answer. The cafe had not transformed his circumstances or altered the fundamental reality of his life. But something had cracked open, some protective shell he had not known he was carrying. He had learned, in 19 years of life under segregation, to expect rejection as the natural state of things, to treat humiliation as inevitable. He had learned not to want what would be denied, not to imagine himself in spaces where he was not permitted, not to feel the full weight of his own exclusion because the weight would be unbearable. The English cafe had not given him freedom. He understood that much. Freedom was not something bestowed by strangers in a foreign country, not something that could be borrowed for the duration of a war, but it had given him a reference point, a lived experience of something he had been told was impossible. It had shown him that the rules he had lived by were not laws of nature, were not inevitable or eternal, were contingent on specific places and specific power structures. And once you knew that, once you felt what it was like to walk through a door without fear, to sit at a table without calculation, to exist in public space as simply yourself, that knowledge could not be unlearned. He knew other colored soldiers who talked about staying in England after the war, who wrote letters to English girls they had met, who made plans that seemed built on hope rather than reality. He could not let himself think that way. He had a mother in Georgia who needed him, a father whose health was failing, sisters who would benefit from another wage earner in the house. And beyond the practical considerations, he could not quite imagine a life permanently severed from home, from the people and places that had made him, even if those places had also wounded him. But he began to carry the cafe with him, an internal space he could return to when the weight of the present became too much. When white officers spoke to him with casual contempt, when he had to stand aside on base while white soldiers were served first at the PX, when letters from home brought news of his cousin's son who had been beaten by police for looking at a white woman wrong. In those moments, he could remember the afternoon light in the cafe, the ordinary click of cup against saucer, the simple fact of being served tea without having to earn the right to it. He went back several times over the months that followed, sometimes with other soldiers, sometimes alone. The woman who ran the cafe learned to recognize him, greeted him by name after he volunteered it, asked how he was keeping. Other cafes and pubs became familiar to him as well, other experiences of casual acceptance that never quite lost their power to surprise. He danced with English girls at a Red Cross social, sat in a cinema without segregation, walked through a public park without checking to see if colored people were allowed. Each small, ordinary freedom was filed away, stored against the future he knew was coming. The war in Europe ended on a May morning in 1945, and by August the war in the Pacific had ended as well. The demobilization orders came through slowly, filtered down through layers of military bureaucracy. His unit would ship out in November, return to the States for processing and discharge. The knowledge sat heavy in his stomach, a countdown to the end of this temporary suspension of rules. In the final weeks before they left, he walked through town more deliberately, paying attention to details he had taken for granted, the way people said hello on the street, the absence of segregation signs, the simple fact of moving through public space without constant vigilance. He knew these things were not universal even in England, that the British had their own hierarchies and exclusions, that he was seeing the country through the particular lens of a temporary visitor. But he also knew that what he had experienced here was real, that it counted for something even if he could not carry it home in any material sense. The last time he visited the cafe, a cold afternoon in late October, the woman who ran it asked him if he was going home soon. He said yes, sometime in the next few weeks. She nodded, said she hoped he'd stay safe, said it had been nice having the American soldiers around, that her town had been livelier for their presence. She said this with no apparent recognition that she was speaking to a soldier whose country would not allow him into most cafes, that the respect she had shown him automatically was something rare and precious in his experience. He thanked her for the tea, for the hospitality, though the words felt inadequate to what he wanted to express. She waved off his thanks, said he was welcome any time, as though he would be returning, as though the future held ordinary continuity rather than the sharp boundary of an ocean crossing. He walked back to base through the gathering dusk, past hedgerows going bare for winter, past fields where crows picked at stubble. The air smelled of coal smoke and coming rain. He thought about Georgia, about the specific quality of light there, the red dirt roads, the weight of summer heat. He thought about how he would explain England to his family, what he could say that they would understand. He thought about the careful adjustment that would be required, the return to rules he had briefly set aside, the resumption of vigilance. But he also thought about the cafe and how he would carry it with him. That ordinary Tuesday afternoon when he had walked through a door and ordered tea and been treated like a person whose presence required no justification. He would carry it through the decades that followed, through the years of labor and constraint, through the slow, grinding work of change that would come to the South. He would carry it as evidence that the world could be otherwise, that dignity was not something that had to be earned or granted, but something inherent, something that could simply be recognized. The world he was returning to would not acknowledge this. The cafes and lunch counters and public spaces of Georgia would remain closed to him for years yet, and when they finally opened, it would be through protest and legislation and the weight of collective action, not through individual courtesy. But he would know, because he had lived it, that the rules were not inevitable. He would know that somewhere, in a small cafe in an English market town, he had been served tea without condition or qualification, and that this had been ordinary and unremarkable to everyone except him. Years later, when his children asked him about the war, he would tell them about the training, the crossing, the work of loading supplies and building roads. He would mention England carefully, aware of how much could not be explained, how the experience would sound like either exaggeration or fantasy. But sometimes, to his eldest daughter, who was preparing to march with others in downtown Atlanta, he would describe the café, the simple act of sitting at a table by the window, the way the light fell through lace curtains onto chipped china. And she would understand, or begin to understand, that freedom was not abstract, was not only the stuff of legislation and court decisions. Freedom could be something as small as a cup of tea, as ordinary as a door that opened to you, as profound as the absence of fear when you occupied space in the world. Her father had learned this in England, and though he had come home to a place that would not honor what he had learned, he had carried it with him nonetheless, a quiet knowledge that could not be taken away. The knowledge lived in him as the years passed, as the South changed slowly and then all at once, as lunch counters opened and waiting rooms integrated, and his children attended schools he had not been allowed to enter. It lived in him through the disappointments and the small victories, through the daily work of endurance and the gradual expansion of possibility. And when he was old, sitting on his porch in the Georgia evening, drinking tea from a cup not so different from the one in that English cafe, he could close his eyes and return to that Tuesday afternoon, to the moment before he stepped through the door, when he had made the decision to walk forward rather than away, to test whether the world might be different than everything he had been taught. It had been different, for a while, in a small corner of England during a war, and though he had lost that difference when he came home, though the years had taught him that change came slowly and incompletely, he never lost the memory of what it had felt like to be treated as though his humanity required no proof or explanation. It was a small thing, perhaps, measured against the weight of a life, against decades of struggle and constraint. But it was also everything. It was the difference between knowing that the world as it existed was the only world possible, and knowing that other worlds, other ways of being, existed and could be achieved. And that knowledge, once gained, could not be surrendered or forgotten, no matter how far he traveled from that cafe with its mismatched tables and its ordinary grace.